The ER was always a place where time seemed to stand still and race forward all at once. The flashing lights from overhead, the beeping of monitors, and the hurried footsteps echoed through the halls. Every minute counted, every decision weighed heavy. The air was thick with urgency and tension, where life and death played out in real time, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Nurses, like the one at the center of it all, were the steady hands in the storm. She moved with practiced efficiency, a calm presence in a world of chaos. Her name was Sarah, and in the midst of every emergency, she was a rock. Her ability to keep a level head, to offer words of comfort, and to make split-second decisions was the reason patients felt safe when they came through the doors. Despite the exhaustion and stress, Sarah never showed a crack in her composure. But today, things were about to take a turn. The doors to the ER burst open, and in walked Dr. Samuel Hayes, the renowned surgeon everyone respected. Well, almost everyone. His reputation preceded him, but so did his arrogance. With a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, he was used to being in control. His presence was commanding, his gaze dismissive, as he barely acknowledged the nurses bustling around him. It wasn't the first time he'd stormed in with an air of superiority, and Sarah had learned long ago not to let it bother her. But today, it felt different. Dr. Hayes didn't waste any time. As he strode into the bustling ER, he barely spared a glance at Sarah, who was standing near the desk, organizing patient files. She had heard of him before. Of course, his reputation was legendary, both for his skills and his ego. But nothing could have prepared her for the sharpness in his voice when he addressed her. "Sarah, is it? I'm sure you're doing your best, but I don't need the extra commentary. Just keep the patients stable, all right?" His tone was clipped, dismissive, as though she were nothing more than an assistant to be directed around. She held her ground, offering a neutral smile. "Of course, Dr. Hayes, but I noticed that Mr. Reynolds in room 3 is showing signs of early sepsis. I'd recommend adjusting his fluids." He looked at her, then back at the rest of the team, a smug smile curling at the corners of his lips. "Really?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Are you sure about that? We don't need a nurse second-guessing my judgment. Thank you. I've handled much worse without needing to adjust anything. Just follow the orders, please." The team, a mix of nurses and junior doctors, exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure whether to step in or stay quiet. Sarah felt the sting of humiliation. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place in this hospital, and to be belittled like this, especially in front of her colleagues, was painful. Yet she didn't let it show. She swallowed the bitter words rising in her throat and nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Understood, Dr. Hayes," she said, her eyes meeting his with a professionalism that masked the hurt. "I'll follow your lead." As he walked away, Sarah's mind raced. This wasn't the first time she had crossed paths with a doctor who thought highly of himself, but something about Hayes unsettled her. There was a sense that, someday soon, they might have no choice but to rely on each other. She just hoped she was prepared for whatever came next. It was just another chaotic day in the ER when the unexpected happened. Dr. Hayes was rushing to handle a high-profile case, one that he'd been anticipating for weeks. A billionaire business tycoon, critical from a sudden heart attack, was being flown in for surgery. It was the kind of case that made Dr. Hayes feel invincible. He'd been speeding through traffic, phone in one hand, briefcase in the other, when his car skidded out of control. The crash was violent. The sound of metal on concrete filled the air as the car slammed into a guardrail, flipping over several times before coming to a halt. By the time the paramedics arrived, Dr. Hayes was unconscious, his body battered and bloodied. The emergency team worked quickly, stabilizing him enough to get him to the very ER he had once dominated with his arrogance. The irony was lost on no one, least of all Sarah. She was just finishing a round when the doors burst open and the stretcher was rushed in. When she saw the blood-soaked sheets and the pale, disoriented man lying unconscious, her heart dropped. And then when she saw the doctor's face, the world seemed to freeze. It was Dr. Hayes. Her initial shock faded quickly, replaced by professional instinct. There was no time to hesitate. She snapped into action, barking orders to the team as they worked to get him onto a bed. She could hear the chaos around her, the frantic voices of doctors and nurses, but none of that mattered now. Dr. Hayes was her patient, and she couldn't let the past color her response. As she assessed his injuries, Sarah noticed the severe trauma to his head and chest, the shallow breathing, and the steady stream of blood coming from a wound in his side. His pulse was weak, barely perceptible, but still there. Her mind raced through all the possible treatments, her hands steady as she applied pressure to the wound and checked his vitals. One of the junior doctors, someone she didn't recognize, approached her. "He's Dr. Hayes, right? Do you think we should call in a specialist?" Sarah didn't even look up from her work. "We do everything we can first," she said, her voice calm and focused. "Get the blood work ready, prep for a chest tube, and get the imaging team on standby. We're doing this now." As she worked, she could feel the weight of Dr. Hayes' earlier words echoing in her mind. The arrogance, the dismissal, it all seemed so trivial now. She wasn't worried about proving him wrong or seeking any kind of vindication. She was focused on one thing, and one thing only: saving his life. The man who had once looked down on her, who had made her feel small in front of others, was now vulnerable. He was just another patient, and Sarah was the one with the power to save him. But the irony didn't escape her. The arrogance he had shown her now felt like a distant memory, swallowed up by the very life-and-death situation they were both in. The room was thick with tension. Sarah's hands worked quickly, but her mind was sharp, focused entirely on Dr. Hayes. Every second mattered. His condition was deteriorating faster than she had hoped. The team was hustling around her, but Sarah was the one calling the shots now. "Pressure's dropping. We need to get fluids in. Stat," she barked, glancing at the junior doctor who was struggling to keep up. "Get the intubation kit ready, now." Her training was kicking in. All the late nights, the endless hours of study, the mock drills, the real-life experiences that had toughened her up, everything she had learned in years of working in the ER was coming to the forefront now. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. She had to make the right calls, and she had to make them fast. As she worked, flashes of her past training moments came to her. She remembered the first time she had been forced to make life-or-death decisions, the pressure that had almost crushed her at first. But over time, she learned to let go of the fear and trust in her abilities. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she stayed calm, every action deliberate and practiced. But this situation was different. Dr. Hayes wasn't just any patient. He was someone who had belittled her, dismissed her expertise, and made her feel insignificant. And now, here he was, completely dependent on her. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes fluttered open, panic evident in them as he tried to take in his surroundings. The room seemed to spin for him, the lights too bright, the voices too loud. Where am I? What happened? I need to go to the surgery." His words came out in a strained whisper, a desperate attempt to hold on to some semblance of control. Sarah placed a firm hand on his arm, her voice low but steady. "Dr. Hayes, listen to me. You're in the ER. You've been in an accident. I need you to stay calm." Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was no superiority in his gaze, only fear. "I know this is hard, but you're going to be okay. We're going to take care of you, but you need to breathe. Focus on me. Just breathe." His chest heaved in uneven breaths as she continued to work, inserting an IV, monitoring his vitals, and watching his body closely for any signs of further deterioration. She could see the panic rising in his eyes again, but she wasn't going to let him spiral. "Dr. Hayes, look at me," she said again, her tone firm but compassionate. "You're not alone in this. We're doing everything we can, but I need you to trust me, okay? Just breathe." The moment felt surreal. The doctor who had once dismissed her now looked to her for reassurance, for comfort. It was a strange twist of fate, but Sarah couldn't focus on that. She had a life to save, and she would not let anything, especially her personal feelings, get in the way. As the room grew quieter, the team working efficiently around her, Sarah remained the calm at the center of the storm. Dr. Hayes might have seen her as nothing more than a nurse once, but right now, she was the one keeping him alive. And that thought, in some small way, helped steady her nerves. As the minutes stretched on, Dr. Hayes' mind began to clear, albeit slowly. The fog of pain and disorientation made it difficult for him to focus, but the reality of his situation slowly began to sink in. The throbbing in his head, the tightness in his chest, and the cold sweat on his skin, it was all too much to ignore. He was not in control here. His breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps as his pulse fluctuated dangerously. Sarah was by his side, her hands working with a calm precision that he had never seen before. The nurse he had once dismissed so easily, the one he had mocked and belittled, was now the one standing between him and the brink of death. She was the one fighting to keep him alive, while he lay vulnerable and helpless. In his disoriented state, memories began to surface. Memories of the times he had dismissed her, of how he had scoffed at her suggestions, how he had brushed off her advice as if it didn't matter. He had been so certain that his knowledge and expertise were all that mattered. He had never truly seen her, never recognized the strength and skill she had. Now, as she worked tirelessly to save him, those memories weighed heavily on him. He felt a shift inside himself, a humbling realization that pierced through the pain. The arrogance that had defined him for so long felt meaningless now. All that mattered was the woman at his side, the woman he had once scorned. "Sarah," he managed to rasp, his voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't pause in her work, but her eyes flicked up to meet his. "I'm sorry," he said, his words thick with regret, "for how I treated you, for not seeing what you're capable of. You're incredible." Sarah's expression softened for a moment, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. She had no time for anything other than the task at hand. But just as the brief moment of sincerity passed, his condition took another sharp decline. His blood pressure plummeted, and his pulse became erratic. A sense of impending loss gripped the room as Sarah's eyes quickly darted to the monitors. "Stay with me, Dr. Hayes," she said through gritted teeth, her hands moving even faster now. "Don't you dare give up." For a moment it felt like the fight was slipping away, and the weight of the situation seemed unbearable. The room held its breath as Sarah pushed herself harder, refusing to accept defeat. The doctor was slipping away, and she had no intention of letting him go just yet. The seconds felt like hours. The beeping of the monitors had changed to a steady, worrisome pattern, a rhythm that sent a chill through Sarah. Dr. Hayes' blood pressure was dangerously low, his pulse thready and weak. His body was failing him, and there was nothing left to do but fight harder. Sarah's hands were slick with sweat as she adjusted the tubes and managed the lines, her mind calculating the next step even as exhaustion threatened to take over. She could feel the weight of the situation in every muscle, but she couldn't stop. Not now. "Dr. Hayes, stay with me," she shouted, her voice breaking through the tension, but there was no response. The doctor's eyes were closed, his body limp, the fight draining out of him. She felt the weight of every decision, every second. She had seen this before, patients on the brink, their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads, but this was different. This was him, the man who had once looked down on her, the one who had made her feel small, was now completely vulnerable, and she was the one holding his life in her hands. The ER team was doing everything they could, but Sarah knew that this was hers to handle. She quickly made the decision to increase the fluids, administer a stronger medication, and manually adjust his chest with deep compressions. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. She pushed through it, telling herself that she could rest later, after the crisis had passed. And then something changed. His pulse, weak at first, began to stabilize. His breathing, shallow and labored, started to become more regular. Sarah didn't stop. She kept the pressure on, kept pushing forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the monitors beeped in a steady rhythm, signaling that his heart had started to beat on its own once again. The room erupted in quiet cheers, but Sarah barely heard it. She was too focused on Dr. Hayes, watching his chest rise and fall, the color slowly returning to his face. She had done it. She had saved him. But as the team celebrated, Sarah stayed in the background. Her breath was ragged, her body aching from the effort, but it was the emotional weight of the moment that hung most heavily on her heart. She had saved a life. Not just any life, but his. And though the victory was sweet, the complexity of it was far from simple. Sarah hadn't saved him for any recognition. She hadn't done it for gratitude or pride. She had done it because she was a nurse, and her duty was to save every life that came through those doors, no matter who they were. When Dr. Hayes finally regained consciousness, the world around him was blurry and disorienting. His head throbbed painfully, and his body felt like it had been put through a grinder. The sterile, white walls of the ER room were the first thing his eyes focused on, followed by the soft, steady beeping of a heart monitor beside him. He blinked, struggling to make sense of his surroundings, when he noticed someone standing near his bed. It was Sarah. Her face was tired, but there was a quiet confidence in her gaze. As his eyes met hers, the weight of everything hit him all at once. He wasn't just alive because of chance. He was alive because of her. Sarah. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She was at his side in an instant, her eyes softening. "Dr. Hayes," she replied, her voice calm and professional, as though nothing had changed. But to him, everything had changed. He swallowed hard, the realization hitting him like a wave. I remember what happened. He stopped himself, the words feeling inadequate. There was so much he wanted to say, but the simplest truth weighed the heaviest. "I was wrong. I've been wrong about you. About everything." Sarah said nothing, but her eyes never left him. She had seen arrogance before, but now in the face of vulnerability, she saw the man behind the mask of ego, someone humbled by the very thing he had so often dismissed. "I treated you terribly," he continued, his voice thick with regret. "I should have never doubted your judgment. You saved my life, Sarah. I owe you everything." For a moment there was silence. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She wasn't one for grand gestures or speeches. Instead, she simply nodded. "It's my job, Dr. Hayes. I'm just doing what I'm trained to do." Her words were gentle but firm. There was no need for more. She didn't do what she did for recognition or thanks. She did it because it was what needed to be done. Dr. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, processing the gravity of her words. When he opened them again, there was something different in his expression. Respect. Not just for her skill, but for her character. He had seen the sharpness of her mind, but now he saw the strength of her heart. "Thank you," he said quietly, the two words holding more weight than anything he could have said before. Sarah simply nodded again, giving him a small, professional smile. There was no need for anything more. The apology was enough. From that moment on, their relationship shifted. No longer was it defined by arrogance or resentment. They moved forward with a shared understanding, a mutual respect for one another, grounded not in words but in actions. In the ER, that was all that mattered. And from that point on, Dr. Hayes would never forget the nurse who had saved him. Not just with her skill, but with her unwavering humanity. Sarah stood in the break room, sipping her coffee as she gazed out the window. The hospital was as chaotic as ever, but in the midst of it all, she had found a quiet moment to reflect. Every day was a challenge, navigating the high stakes, the pressure, the lives in her hands. Yet she never wavered. This was her calling, her passion. But it wasn't easy. The emotional toll of the ER, the weight of every decision, was something only those in the field could truly understand. She thought of Dr. Hayes, and how, just a few days ago, their relationship had been defined by pride and disdain. Now it had shifted to one of mutual respect. It wasn't about recognition, about proving a point, or about needing to be seen. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter the circumstances. She had saved his life, not for praise, but because it was her job. And that, to her, was the highest form of dedication. Dr. Hayes had changed too. The arrogance that once defined him had been replaced with a genuine respect for the woman who had pulled him from the edge of death. Their roles in the ER had always been clear, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them. A partnership forged through struggle, vulnerability, and empathy. As Sarah walked back to her station, a quiet sense of hope settled in her chest. Growth, she knew, was often born in the hardest moments. And in the end, it was empathy that truly made the difference. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this emotional journey and the powerful transformation of the characters. If you felt moved by this story, don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one. And hey, don't forget to share it with your friends so they can experience this too. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing you amazing content. Until next time, take care and stay tuned for more.